Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for coming here. It's a great opportunity to discuss something that I feel is of great importance. I would say that I'm more interested in discussing this topic with you guys than just dosing my brilliant information with you, because I don't think necessarily, I'm not convinced that I know what I'm talking about, and that's probably also why I want to say that I hate logic, because I'm trying to use logic to kind of dispel this myth of the supremacy of the emerging AI. Anyway, so where I'm coming from is I'll try to just move into this theme or thematics with a certain humility, because I think that I probably haven't really figured out what I'm talking about, and I'm trying to build an argument that I haven't fully thought through. But I want participation. That's much more interesting than just trying to have a fully well-formulated argument for you guys to kind of sift through in a way. So everybody's aware that a lot of AI tools, either in academia or in the real world, large language models, have this black box phenomenon. You're all aware of this, and you probably are familiar with how it works and how it's completely opaque. And when it comes to the context of what is the role and the impact of these new AI tools in and from this perspective of the humanities, I would say that it exposes the value and the risk related to critical thinking. So a lot of these tools have this simplicity lever, and this slide explains that, showing that the more simplified you do your queries and how it operates, it opaques the complexity of the topics you want to go into. So the harder and more unpacked the complexity is, the more critical thinking it requires, but that makes it slower and more difficult, and probably also less easy to operationalize in a way. So, before I go into my argument, I'd just like to use a case study. And you've all heard about Palantir, right? This kind of Darth Vaderian tech company in the US. The CEO, pictured here, it's interesting because he's a philosopher. I think that what is interesting with a lot of these tech companies, including Palantir, is that his supervisor was Habermas. He has a PhD from Frankfurt in critical theory. But that's where my respect stops, in a way. Yeah, let's just move on to his letter to his shareholders. I would like you to read it, because it kind of exposes this deep normative core of a lot of these tech companies and how they have an agenda, even though they have this streamlined, beautiful toolkit of AI products that they want to sell to a market. And in many ways, these are military buyers. But if you read the last line, and probably also in the middle there, it says, "It is and was a mistake to casually proclaim that equality, the equality of all cultures," which is an interesting way to communicate with your shareholders, I would argue. But that is his agenda. And, even the Norwegian police and the customs department have bought products from Palantir. I mean, that's not a criticism for them. They probably made some well-argued choices there, but my point is that at the core of these large tech companies, including Palantir, there's a normative assumption about the validity of what they're doing. That's not all about neutral technology. And you see how it kind of pans out when they actually apply it to something socially vulnerable. For example, health services in the UK during the COVID pandemic, where the way in which Palantir's services were implemented, at least after the fact was subject to a lot of criticism when it came to data privacy. I think they just basically just blatantly sold off 12 to 13 million patient records to Palantir without any kind of consent or any kind of limit to the degree of privacy that was based in that transaction. So, and this is a hard slide to devour. I apologize for that. This is actually a very old slide. This is Google DeepMind. You see it all the way up in the top there. It's just a screen dump from their homepage, or it's a part of their page, their homepage, where they try to convince us about the validity of doing Markovian games, which is this kind of a utilitarian sifting of different alternatives in a probabilistic manner, where I want to show you the kind of the social science and humanities core of a lot of the assumptions that they build into their services. Because a lot of the stuff that they're going to build into these Markovian games, where they kind of show, I think an example of this is like if you have a group of agents, which is usually people, we want to have a lever here, and it's about, we have one lever that's competition, another lever that's resource allocation. So if you have a lot of resources, you have scarce resources, you have a lot of competition, or you have cooperation, then you can model behavior in a group. And this is applied to, as they say, economy, traffic, environmental challenges, etc. The point is that a lot of these implicit assumptions that they build these services on are lent from or borrowed from the social sciences, rational agent theory, cognitive capacity, and the notion of intelligence. And as you read further down the line, they just basically say it straight out loud what they adhere to. Self-interested people often work together to achieve great things. Why should this be the case when it is in their best interest to just care about their own well-being and disregard that of others? The question of how and under what circumstance selfish agents cooperate is one of the fundamental questions in the social sciences. Yeah, ish. There's room to operate there. So it just proves my point that this is one of the biggest. I think Google DeepMind won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, not for this, but for something else. It was AlphaFold. The point is that these kinds of unreflexive utilization of social theory, of theoretical underpinnings coming from the humanities are there in tech companies and in the big platforms that we use, but they're used in an unreflexive way. That's one aspect of the challenges of what the humanities and the social sciences face, is actually seeing that theories and assumptions coming from the social sciences and the humanities are being utilized in an extremely unreflexive way. So, this big fear now that AGI is coming is another assumption that's interesting. I think it needs a sustained and complex discussion, probably should be emerging out of the humanities itself. And it's coming out of this notion of the supremacy of these large language models and how they potentially will kind of come and claim a super intelligence, in that sense, just outcompete, rational discourse and how we can operate as moral and rational agents. So you heard about the liar's paradox? Any of you? Yeah. And I think it basically is probably the best example of the limits of large language models, and also this punctuate this dream that large language models, or AI, at some point will converge and become super intelligent. Because the liar's paradox proves something quite simple, actually. It's an example from logic where if the statement is true, then the meaning must be false. If the meaning is false, the statement must be true. So it's a paradox. And if you think about the way in which we are now sold a potential future where AGI is coming, because it's a closed system, it's a formal system, and will always be a formal system, it can never kind of capture or encapsulate something that's beyond the system itself, beyond the semantic meaning of a proposition. You know, you have to kind of work on this a little bit, but if you see how AGI is working, it's a little bit like talking to somebody who sees something different than you. I'm talking to people coming from the engineering sciences all the time. I spent a decade working with engineering science background, or people coming from the engineering sciences, and we were talking about this. It's almost like we're talking about different things. We're seeing the same phenomenon, but some people see a duck, and somebody is seeing a rabbit. They can't see it both at the same time. And in that sense, I feel there's an incongruence or a kind of incommensurability of discourse between the social sciences and humanities on one side and the engineering sciences on the other. And it's almost impossible to encapsulate that kind of, I would say, an abyss of conceptualization, lack of overlap, and the shared language of understanding that is required to actually frame this in a precise way so we can frame these translational challenges between these different disciplines. And I have to share this because this is my favorite slide in the world. And you probably see a little dent up there. It's everybody that's taking a PhD or in the process of it probably can relate. But that's not the most important thing. I once attended a seminar at UiO. I was actually a secretary for the seminar in seminar i vitenskapsteori. And I was supervising maybe 60 of those seminars, and there's one slide in one seminar I remember, and that's this slide. And why? It's because it's a philosopher of science called Dragana Buzin. And I probably will completely paraphrase, but I hope she forgives me. But she had this accent as well. I was kind of she's from the Balkans, I think. And she said, and there was like a long pause. It's like, this is the slide. Come on. She said, you know, I'm not really interested in science. And then a long pause. I am interested in the limits of science. And this is the relationship to what we're talking about, because large language models, any formal system, any kind of data sets, or any kind of metadata, any kind of epistemological framing of an area of knowledge will always be limited to what we know. But it can never really move beyond that circle. The only thing that changes is the size of that circle. And the boundary to the unknown will increase directly related to the amount of data you have inside the circle. There's always going to be an like a balloon that increases all the time. The more you put into the balloon, the boundary towards ignorance will always increase in equal measures. And this is also like impossible to talk with computer scientists about. It's almost like you're talking Esperanto for some reason. I don't know why. So the only way I can talk to computer scientists about this is trying to use logic. And I'm really bad at logic, to be honest. I'm trained as a philosopher, but I flunked in logic. And this is the formalization of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And I'm not going to unpack it. This is just how it looks. But the point is that there exists statements that are true, but cannot be proven from the rules of the system. The system is therefore incomplete. And such a system, a closed system, cannot prove its own consistency. And my point is neither can ChatGPT or any kind of large language model, any kind of AI. So this is a deeply humanist issue, right? And I'm not trying to discuss about metaphysics here. It's about really encapsulating the insight that there is always going to be true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. And this is the endeavor of the social sciences and the humanities, not computer scientists. And it could never be on the turf of a large language model. This is not, OpenAI's agenda. It's within the confines and the mandate of the social sciences and the humanities to discuss. And we are the ones who can frame this in a precise way. So what has it to do with AI? I think today's AI systems are formal systems. Large language models are fundamentally formal systems. Even though they don't work on logic, they work on probabilities. They can only work within the logical structures and the rules that they've been given. There are some caveats. Large language models are trained via gradient descent, and they encode vast statistical regularities. They do not have privileged sets of statements, such as statements taken as true. However, they give an illusion of reasoning, illusion of deduction, illusion of, they can simulate logic or deduction in a formal sense. But the reason why we then project reasoning to AI systems is that people, including AI experts, lacked strict definitions of true correct reasoning. And large language models can simulate reasoning processes well enough to solve some problems. And then maybe most interesting, though, that we can always look at the so-called ELIZA effect, which is coming from this first chatbot in the 60s, where they did research on that, and they saw that the respondent's response or reaction to the chatbot ELIZA was so that the fluent textual communication of large language models led them to project human-like capacity to the chatbot. And that is the challenge in and of itself with projecting capacities to an AI system that it doesn't have. Another aspect is the algorithmic design itself. I think that this is just one of many algorithms that are really one of the main drivers of large language models. They are based on the model's internal predictions into probabilities, and they select the next most likely word. What's problematic with that? And that is intrinsically a normative core to how they build those algorithms. So the most frequent in the training data depends on whose language, whose cultural patterns, whose way of expressing meaning dominated the training data. And that is, of course, problematic when you look at the assumptions built into what's most relevant. It will implicitly create a kind of race to the bottom of consensus built on primarily Western, primarily American assumptions about validity, what's true, what's relevant, and what's kind of, it is an implicit bias generator in a way. So, this is the question I want to discuss with you guys. What happens when these fundamentally limited systems increasingly shape the way we understand and interpret the world? Anybody seen this picture before? No, it's quite a famous picture. It's actually the first image or a picture of a photograph taken with a blitz. What's a blitz? That's a flashlight. So it's Nadar in the 1850s, and he brought his camera down into the catacombs in Paris, and he took a picture. And the reason why I'm showing this is because what is required to kind of capsulate or encapsulate the novelty and the contextual change that happens when you place artificial light into a place where it hasn't ever seen a flashlight before, and you take a picture of it. that way of showing something completely original and putting it in a historical context is something that an AI will never do. That type of interpretive discourse that kind of comes out of that moment, you will never have an AGI that does that. And the problem is that when we lean ourselves more and more heavily on the use of AI tools, of large language models, and place them into our interpretive endeavors as social scientists and scholars, these kinds of interpretive moments will kind of pale, and we are not able to kind of discern novelty in the same way as we did prior to the use of AI. That's my proposition. I wouldn't say that's correct, but that's just one way of using that example as a way to see there's a certain interpretive capacity that will never be something that you can outsource to an AI, even with computer vision or whatever. So, crisis of the humanities. AI-generated interpretations may reinforce cultural distortions. We risk encoding historical inaccuracies. And, MIT Media Lab says excessive reliance on AI-driven solutions contributes to cognitive atrophy. So going back to the photograph, I think the capacity and the, let's call it, interpretive muscle, that's really, really the core of the humanities and the social sciences, needs to be articulated to combat this lenience towards AI tools, in a way. And then we should say, what is at stake here? We should try to articulate the way in which the humanities need to reclaim the power to define. Algorithms increasingly determine what counts as knowledge, what patterns matter, and what interpretations are valid. So there's a loss of humanistic agency. And there's also potentially as outsourcing of moral agency to autonomous systems. So humanities must retain an interpretive authority, and we need kind of a new reflection of what is an epistemic framing of valid and solid knowledge. I would also go so far as to say that the crisis, maybe and maybe not, there's a crisis in the humanities, but I would say that the atrophy itself is probably at most at risk when it comes to this double loop and maybe even triple loop learning capacity that's at the core of the interpretive endeavor in the humanities. And we risk, I think we see this already in the students at the universities, a kind of McVersity phenomenon when people lean too much on their AI tools in their trading as students and scientists. And it hinders this cross-cultural and cross-conceptual pollination that is deeply depending on the quality of essential innovation and novelty, both in academia and in industry. Yeah, I won't go into the rest, but you get the picture. So, you all familiar with Duchamp? This is actually kind of reiterating my point about the image of Nadar. But I think that AI art and AI music, AI films, AI script writing is here to stay. Maybe because of economy in a way. But I think that what's at risk when it comes to the interpretive atrophy that we see when it comes to lenience towards AI is that when there's this self-enforcing mechanism in leaning towards AI in different kinds of humanities and arts, I would argue, is that there's going to be a flattening of interpretive capacity. I think you will see that interpretation of something artistic or something cultural is going to be losing its nuance, losing its depth, where Duchamp's moment of discursive innovation, which is exactly both a semantic one and an artistic one will never be capsulated by an AI. But if we tend to lose our capacity to recognize that, I think the humanities and the social sciences are deeply at risk. Another point is also funny is because I've used this image of another art piece, a found object of Duchamp, using it as an example of showing the interpretive importance coming in from the humanities and the social sciences when we're working on social phenomena with the use of, or in collaboration with the technical sciences. And I'm asking them because many of the, no criticism in general, but many of the engineers or, AI researchers I talk to say, what are we looking at here? And they, of course, say, oh, it's a urinal. And no, this is actually an art piece by Duchamp. And and it's called The Fountain, and the phenomenon they see, going back to the duck rabbit, it's not to try to kind of pull the discursive card and say we know more than you, but just seeing that there's a dimension of contextuality and interpretation that's completely lacking because of the training of IT engineers. That pushes us to a point where I would say probably the granular and the embodied knowledge that is required to do an interpretive process towards an art piece or a piece of work or a piece of writing or a piece of text is kind of disappearing in front of our eyes, in a way. This is a deeply held belief I have, that when we want to collaborate with computer scientists and other engineering sciences, real translation is almost impossible. It's almost impossible. I think that I've worked at Digital Life Norway for 5 years. I also worked with AI researchers at OsloMet. I worked in the Research Council of Norway, and within the nanotechnology field. And I've never really seen examples of true translation between the social science and humanities framing of issues, ethics, societal impact, and the functional problems that are clear and present for an IT engineer, for example. So, engineering science frames societal impact as an additionality, and there's a hindrance, and it's almost like a constraint to their work. But trying to develop a double or triple loop learning, like why do we think the way we think? How am I thinking about the way I think? Who am I to think the way I think? Creates such resistance, and it's so slow that I think that the importance of the work is evident, but it requires a completely different time frame. And the reason why I think it's so slow is because the fundamental epistemic and normative training that is required on the other side of the table probably takes a decade before people agree on the fundamental terms. So it goes back to maybe we need a new science war. So there's this positivism that goes into how we frame not only the way that AI works, but also how we interpret the world, that needs a new kind of discourse around the awareness of normativity and the already situatedness of the actors involved in the research endeavor involving AI. And there's also a struggle of epistemic authority, I would argue. Yeah. And I'll end with a last image. I don't really know why I have it there, but I think it's compelling. And nobody's, I don't know, nobody's seen this image before, but you heard about grieving wives. So in Greece, I think all over Europe, I think up until this day, there were kind of a profession. They were actually paid to partake in funerals to express the grief that the participants in the funeral were unable to express themselves. And I think it's more like, it's not necessarily pessimistic, but I would say that it's an example of a role that I feel that social scientists and humanities scholars have in tech collaborative research, where they are placed there. They're funded to establish doubt. So they're basically paid to doubt and to express the normative, ethical, societal aspects that are completely invisible, usually, for the rest of the consortium. Probably also the people who fund them. And in some way, I think that's probably a sad kind of ending to my presentation, but I would say that I hope that the humanities and the social sciences will kind of move out of that role and be able to fully engage with the collaborators who are working on to move out of this crisis of the humanity in itself. So I think that's, yeah, let's just hope that we're not ending up as grieving wives in funerals for the future of our Western society, in a way, to be a little bit exaggerating. Yeah, thank you.